Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 207, covering the week of March 2nd through March 6th, 2020. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address and we'll give you a free ebook. You'll get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email, which includes a link to this podcast on Saturday or Sunday. Also, please download our free mobile application. Just go to your app store and search for Abbeville Institute. You'll find it, download it, and you've got the Abbeville Institute on the go. You've got our podcast, all of our lectures, and of course, a mobile link to the website. It's a great way, again, free of charge, to keep in touch with the Institute off of your mobile device. While you're at abbevilleinstitute.org, click on that support tab, and you'll see a button that says donor options. Click on that, and it'll take you right out to our donor page. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. And of course, all your donations are tax deductible to the full extent of the law. You can help support what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition and help us keep this podcast going, our website, our conferences, all the things that we do that we need your generous support to do. So it's painless, it's easy. Just click on that donor options. We also have options if you want to have planned giving or stock options, all kinds of things to donate to the Institute. So click on those tabs. You'll see that right there. Also click on that shop tab and you can get our Abbeville Institute apparel. It's great, high quality embroidered stuff. So if you like our podcast and you like our mission, you like us, you can advertise the Institute by wearing a hat or a polo shirt, fleece, or t-shirt, all kinds of great things that you can wear for the Abbeville Institute. And of course, it has our logo on it. People ask you, hey, what's this Abbeville Institute? You can tell them. So it's a great way to help us. We get a little dough out of that. And of course, you can advertise as well. And of course, always share our material out on social media. Rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. That is a great way to organically grow our audience. All right, all that said, let's talk about the week that was. First and foremost, we didn't have a podcast last week, and I'm getting this late this week because of some family issues, but hopefully, well, those will all be addressed by this next weekend, and I can get back to the regular schedule. So this podcast is coming late. Maybe next weekend might be late as well, or maybe early. I don't know how that's going to work, and we'll be back on our regular schedule, barring any unforeseen circumstances in the following week. So, episode 207. A lot of great stuff this week. I mean, I think the theme of this week was what Yankees say and what Southerners say. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's what Yankees say the South is all about, or what Yankees say about the South and what the South really is. It's the Yankee destruction of America and the Southern response to that, I think, in so many ways. And so I'm going to kind of work backwards. I'm going to pick the Friday and Thursday pieces first, and then I'm going to work to the real meat of the week, which was the first three pieces of the week. But I want to start with this Friday piece about Bernie Sanders and Simon Legree. Just about anybody who lives in America has either read or knows about Uncle Tom's Cabin. What most people don't know about that book is that Simon Legree was completely fabricated. In fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe had only lived in Kentucky for a very short amount of time, visiting, not actually physically living there. And so she based her entire book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, on hearsay. And Simon Legree was actually a northerner who settled in the South and established a plantation, of course, was a brutal slave owner. He's an imaginary figure of an imaginary South. And Bernie Sanders is also dealing in imagination, an imagination for what America is or what it could be or what it was. And Bernie Sanders, in some ways, reflects a major problem in America. First of all, Bernie Sanders is from New York, but of course, he calls Vermont his home. And he is, in many ways, the quintessential Yankee, the imperialist, the one who wants to determine what everybody else is going to be and how everyone else is going to live in the United States. And of course, it's going to be in his socialist utopian nightmare, at least from my perspective. Now, others might think differently. One thing that's interesting about Bernie Sanders, though, and of course the Monday piece talks about Bernie Sanders as well, is that Bernie Sanders is in some ways a perversion of the American tradition. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the Occupy Wall Street people, which forms in some ways part of the core of the Bernie Sanders group, the Occupy Wall Street people had it right. They understood that there was something fundamentally wrong with America. And yet they put their faith in a socialist because it's misguided. Socialism is not an American ideology in any way. In fact, the American tradition, which is agrarian, is not an ideology at all. It is a real, tangible thing. But the Bernie Sanders followers know that there is something fundamentally wrong with the Hamiltonian system, which is what they're essentially critiquing. And there is something wrong with it. Jefferson, John Taylor of Caroline, John Randolph of Roanoke, a host of Jeffersonians pointed out the problems with it. Abel Upshur and others pointed out the problems with it long before the war in 1861. They've been defeated, thoroughly routed by Hamiltonianism and the Yankee Empire. And so Bernie Sanders is tapping into that strain of Americanism that's there, that can see something's wrong, but they just don't know what to do about it. And they're embracing a socialist who, as Paul Yarborough says, really wants to make everyone slaves in America. They want to make everyone slaves to the government in one way or another. This is why he says Bernie Sanders wants to repeal the 13th Amendment, because he wants to enslave Americans. And this idea that Americans are enslaved after the war comes from the fact that the American financial system has made slaves of a lot of Americans, financial slaves, because of credit, because of a system of high inflation and other things that forces Americans into a dependency in one way or another. And so when you look at this and people say, gosh, we're dependent on this, we're not independent people anymore. The Bernie Sanders response is, well, we need more government to make people independent. I mean, it's a paradox that doesn't even make any sense. It's an oxymoron. Have people get more government to be more independent. It's a certain type of liberty that Sanders espouses. It's a freedom from fear. People are afraid of economic difficulty. They're afraid of being destitute. They're afraid of these things. So that fear creates a palpable response, and that response is, well, provide me a service or a program so I won't have that fear any longer. If I lose my job, I won't have a fear of being unemployed. If I get sick, I won't have a fear of not having a doctor. If I grow old, I won't have a fear of not having a job and being retired. If I want to go to college, I won't have a fear for trying to pay for that. This is a freedom from fear, and it's a New England puritanical view of liberty. In sharp contrast to what you would see in the South, which is a freedom to. When you look at Virginia, look at Cavalier or Celtic, what's often borderland ideas of liberty. It's a freedom to. The freedom to explore what they want to do, the freedom to achieve. And so while these people are gaining freedom from, they're also losing freedom to. And that marks the difference, really, in so many ways. It's a cultural difference between Bernie Sanders and the rest of America in a lot of ways. Now, not all of America. I mean, there are Southerners who would subscribe to Bernie Sanders' vision of liberty. And, of course, those in the West and the far West and New England. And there are those in New England and the West and the far West and the South who would subscribe to the freedom too. You have two different American views of liberty here that are still battling it out in 2020 that were around in the 17th century, in the 1600s, when the Virginia Cavaliers were suspicious of the Massachusetts Puritans and their vision of America. Nothing has changed. This is why America always needed decentralization, because Bernie Sanders could espouse his freedom from all he wanted in New England, and New England could be the socialist utopia that Bernie Sanders wants. I mean, he's been very highly complimentary of Fidel Castro, and of course took his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. If that's what he wanted, and that's what the people of Vermont or Massachusetts or Connecticut or New Hampshire wanted, then they could get it. But they wouldn't subject the rest of the United States to that. That's where federalism works. That's why we do what we do at the Abbeville Institute, because we promote this idea of real federalism in the American/Jeffersonian political tradition. Jefferson's greatest commitment politically was to federalism. Even if he had radical views for his time on certain issues, they stopped at Virginia. And that's something I've said a lot on this podcast. We've talked a lot about on the website. But of course, that's not how most of America thinks about the South. The way most America thinks about the South is a terrible place where every villain has a Southern accent, where everything bad comes out of the South, where everything negative is from the South. And so when you look at the list of movies that Clyde Wilson listed, Clyde Wilson had in his latest Southerners movie guide, these are the films he says to avoid at all costs. Films like The Southerner and Hurry Sundown, Walk the Line and Fled and A Face in the Crowd, Gods of the Lake, or Shy People, The Gift, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, all of the Tennessee Williams plays, Convicts, Shag the Movie, The Education of Little Tree, Spencer's Mountain, Forrest Gump, To Kill a Mockingbird, LBJW, Alamo Bay, Scorchers, Crimes of the Heart, Cross Creek, God Save Texas. And he said he could continue this all day. And of course, then he offers some films, modern films, that actually have a nice theme to them that are either good or tolerable because of the way they portray Southerners. Thunder Road and Sharky's Machine and Southern Comfort and The Newton Boys, Rush, The Real McCoy, Con Air, even Con Air. One film that, of course, he didn't get to, that I found, it's not on the list, but is this Ford versus Ferrari, a nice portrayal of Shelby from Texas, who had the Shelby Cobra, and then, of course, the Shelby Mustang. And so there are good Southern movies out there. But again, this is the perception of the South. The perception of the South as some place that is awful and some place that is the root of all evil in America. He says in this piece, the most vicious and vile criminals always have Southern accents. Quite often they have Confederate flags on their walls and vehicles. Hollywood movie makers know that this will create an automatic antipathy in most of their viewers since they strongly feel such antipathy themselves. This is true even when the scene is far from Dixie, like Primal Fear or Copycat or Fire with Fire or Deadfall. And the most despicable people always have the most unmistakable Southern accents, unlike most of the likable characters in movies taking place in the South. So, again, perception of the South, Bernie Sanders, a whole different view of the world, a distorted Americanism. So if this is the case with Southerners, and this is the case how Southerners are portrayed, well, what can we do about it? Well, we had 3 pieces this week that answer that question in some ways, and we'll start with the Wednesday piece, again, working backwards. The Benedict option is spiritual secession. So Aaron Gleason points out all of these negative things that have been said about the South, or the deplorables, as Hillary Clinton called them. It doesn't have to just be the South, but just traditional Americans. The people that wear Make America Great Again hats. The people that chortle at redneck Republicans who can't find Ukraine on the map. And so Aaron Gleason, who's from California, who's in favor of California independence, even though he's conservative, says, this is the problem. So what we really need to do is just secede personally, spiritually, from this type of nonsense. He says, but the Southern tradition is exactly the opposite. I think probably without knowing it, Rod Dreher's Benedict option is a variation on this. It should probably be considered within the scope of Southern conservatism. Instead of soaking the culture war by building our moral foundation upon it, the Benedict option is supposed to be cooling water. Not for the U.S. Federation, but for your soul. The criticism, he says, I always hear of the Benedict option is that Dreher wants us all to move to the same street and not vote, which doesn't sound that bad to me. But the truth is, it's nothing more radical than what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. Our contemporary Caesars should mostly be rendered indifferent and occasional resistance. And given the complete lack of natural interest and impeachment fiasco, it seems that Americans are at least functionally more open to Benedict option than anybody realized. The Benedict option, he said, is primarily a secession of the heart. The business of the Christian life and healthy life in general has never changed. James Davison Hunter was argued persuasively 10 years ago that the job of the Christian was not to change the world, nor was it to engage in eternal cultural warfare. The Christian life is about taking responsibility for what we're really responsible for. That means our families, communities, schools, and everything immediately adjacent to us. Those things are not there by accident. They are there by providence. Like the Samaritan in Jesus' parable, we have been provided with neighbors in need. They are our first concern. And so this is important because we think of secession politically, but there are other ways for secession. And I think Aaron is entirely right here. The Southern tradition is about sweeping around your own back door, taking care of yours first, and then worrying about everything else. It's bottom up. It's what Virginia did when it opposed the decrees from the governor in Richmond in the colonial period. They just ignored it. It's what the sheriff would do. They would ignore bad legislation, bad laws. It's ignoring. It is a type of nullification. It is a type of secession. It is entirely American. And so when you have Bernie Sanders and you have all this negative about the South, well, I mean, or the American tradition, conservatism, whatever you want to call it, well, then it's that point where you say, okay, well, what can we do about it? Well, we can just ignore it. Ignore it and live our lives the best way we can. Ignore it and live our lives in a way that reflects traditional America. And I think that's what I really like about this particular piece, because it's not political. It's cultural. It's a cultural view of independence. And I think that's something that we can immediately do as people think about, with angst, they wring their hands. What can be done? We have all these horrible things. Well, you take matters into your own hands in some ways. I mean, you can't politically, in our current situation, you're still going to have to abide by some of the rules of the overseers and in the federal city. But you could say, I'm not going to engage in these other things, and I'm going to turn them off. I'm not going to do them. I'm not going to pay attention to them. I'm going to pay attention to the things that are here. It's hard to do in the world of social media and modern mass media, and to turn those things off and turn away from them. It's very hard to do. But taking care of family and then community first are the things that are most valuable to any society. He mentions my podcast in this piece, my Think Locally, Act Locally mantra in my own podcast. If you don't get that, just go out and look for BrianMcClanahan.com, B-R-I-O-N, McClanahan.com, and you can find my podcast. But that is the theme of my podcast, Think Locally, Act Locally. It's the way to do it, to think about your school board instead of what federal education policy is. To think about helping your neighbor instead of what kind of billions are going to be spent on American health care from the center, or welfare, or whatever it is. So think about helping the people around you, and of course be taking care of your own family first. Trying to do everything you can in that way. The people nearest to you. When the Middle Ages, when we had the first real census in the Middle Ages, the Doomsday Book from William the Conqueror, and you look at large towns in the Middle Ages, that would be like your subdivision today. I mean, that would have been a large town back in the Middle Ages. People wouldn't have left that. They would have focused on that town. They would have known the people there, and that would have been very intimate. Families would have known each other for generations, good and bad. And there's something nice about that. If you watch children's shows, it's something that I think, I've had, young kids. It's something to, a lot of the children's shows have small towns. People love small. They don't love big cities. They don't love what the city represents. They love small. They love to know the people around them and know who these people are. Because if you don't, it's impersonal. You live in a world without any connections. And so you look at all the kid shows have very small little communities, not big cities, but small little communities. And while they say, well, let's go to the city, it's going to be great, they only visit. You'll notice that. The only one that's different is Sesame Street, right? That's different. Of course, there's a leftist agenda there. But most of your kids' television programming is dedicated to the small. The people around you, the small town, the little place, the good communities, close-knit societies. In other words, these television shows, kids' television shows, tend to reflect a Southern vision, the Southern tradition, the Jeffersonian vision of America. Small is beautiful. And so on that account, the piece I published on Tuesday, it's a chapter from my book with Clyde Wilson, Forgotten Conservatives in American History, and it's about Who Owns America, which, by the way, will be one of our conferences this year, I believe, probably sometime in the fall. But the Who Owns America, the whole premise of that is built on I'll Take My Stand, which was published in 1930, Who Owns America in 1936. And Who Owns America is a better book. It's a more concise book, a harder hitting book, and it draws in a number of other authors. It's not just 12. There's tremendously more authors in it. And even people like Halyar Belliok, who's a European, but was interested in the Southern tradition. He's very much in the mold of G.K. Chesterton, or they're all distributionists. And the main critique is that, look, we're not capitalist or Marxist. We're something else. We're agrarians. We're Southern agrarians. And the whole theme of the book is, what can we do to save America, to save the American tradition? This is written at the heart of the Great Depression. What can we do about it? Well, it's decentralization. It's regional government. It's recognizing differences in Americans and not having one-size-fits-all policies, which aren't going to work long-term because they create divisiveness and problems. This is where Hillary Clinton can stand up and say you have a basket of deplorables. Well, it's divisiveness. And that's divisiveness in the way that she knows that she's not going to get their vote anyway, so why does it matter? She can just turn her nose up at those people, the great unwashed of America, and say they're awful because it doesn't matter. Centralization allows you to do that. The 50 plus 1% allows you to do that. And so these men were writing essays based on the idea that somehow we could decentralize, create regional governments, bring back this agrarian order, which is this whole idea of small is beautiful, save the American farmer, or the Jeffersonian who's not a farmer, but save these people. You don't have to be a farmer to be a Jeffersonian, but save this type of worldview. Save it from complete destruction. It is the bedrock of the American experience. And I called the piece a Mass for the Resurrection. And there's a couple of pieces I point out in this particular essay. Frank Owsley, who was one of the authors in I'll Take My Stand, wrote a very good essay entitled The Foundations of Democracy. And he said, it was only after Lincoln's death that it became apparent that the higher law had been invoked, not to bring freedom and happiness to the slave, but rather to bring to the great bankers, railroad magnates, and industrialists. In short, it was in reality the industrialists and corporations who invoked the higher law to gain control of the national government and to make it over according to their desire. Yet Owsley emphasized that the higher law had been distorted. The founders subscribed to a higher law, not the one advanced by the Republican Party from the 1850s onward. His higher laws, expounded by Jefferson, Henry Dickinson, and Samuel Adams, was and is the absolute denial of the totalitarian state. Neither kings nor parliaments, foreign or domestic, had complete sovereignty over the individual. And this higher law, he said, was born from their common experience in history. Quote, from the Anglo-Saxon days when God was supposed to have made the laws and the king and the council only declared what they were, from the charter of Henry I, who acknowledged the supremacy of immemorial customs and laws, from King John, who signed the Magna Charta, and all the kings who came after him, who in similar fashion admitted that their sovereignty over subjects was limited. The jurists Coke, Littleton, and Blackstone confirmed the limitations of sovereignty, and Brown, Hobbes, Milton, and Locke, the philosophers, stated in broad abstract terms the theories of limited sovereignty. The philosophers of the American Revolution stated these principles more clearly, and as I have said, they made these principles the foundation of the American state. They were called natural rights. And Owsley said among these natural rights were the right to self-government, that is, government was made to serve man. Man was not made to serve government, and when government failed to serve man, it should be changed peaceably as possible, forcibly if need be. Of course, Owsley connected these people to the Jeffersonians, to what we call agrarians. But of course, Owsley said Jefferson wouldn't even support states' rights today. They would support regional governments. They would look at America and say, we need regional governments, not just state governments. So that theme carries throughout the book, the need for political regionalism by Donald Davidson. Nationalism was the enemy. I think this is the case. We don't understand what the assault on America has been. It's, as Davidson said, the towers of New York built upon southern and western backs. That's the problem. The solution is more decentralization and regionalism. A government that reflects the culture of the people that it represents. And you're not going to get that from a national authority. And that said, we finally have the piece on Monday by Neil Kumar when he gets into environmental conservatism or environmental right. And when you hear that term environmental, you think immediately Greens. You think of the environmentalist movement. And what Kumar says is, well, certainly that's part of being good stewards of the environment, is something that Southerners had long done better than anybody else. That was Jefferson. That was Taylor. John Taylor of Caroline was writing agrarian treatises because that's what would preserve best the Southern tradition. Arator, for example, because he understood farming was the basis, the backbone of a real America. And Kumar says what we need to do is take that by the horns and go with it. Say, okay, if that is the core of Jeffersonianism, well, we should be the best conservationists out there. And he gives some really interesting examples. If we're really interested in environmentalism, why do we trade with China so much? We should just cut off China entirely. China is polluting everything. If we want real sound environmental industrialization, well, we should do it right here in the United States because the United States has stronger environmental laws than almost anywhere else in the world. So why aren't we building factories here? And why aren't the environmentalists out there complaining about factories in China? They should be advocating factories in the United States. Things that we need, of course. These people would say we don't need factories at all, and I would disagree with that. But we should be advocating things here. If we really are interested in environmentalism, we should be against poaching and other things that would destroy the environment. We should be favoring the small community farm over the large industrial farm. And we should be looking at our own environment, our own back door, our own backyard to try to improve the lives of the people around us. He says we have to reclaim the mantle of conservation, expose the faux environmentalists for what they are. This would greatly improve our prospects with youth. We must integrate environmental protection into our platform. This does not mean nebulous and capriciously overburdensome regulation, such as banning plastic straws, bags, and fluorescent light bulbs, or instituting carbon-neutral building codes and fuel standards, or stunting our energy independence. No, this means a national tree planting campaign, strengthening the penalties for animal abuse and littering, properly funding and staffing the National Park Service, our national treasure, and game agencies, and refocusing the Environmental Protection Agency on the basic enforcement of Clean Air and Water Acts. We should eliminate ethanol subsidies and federal funding for both apocalyptic climate propaganda and quixotic alternative energy sources. We can use our environmental program as a springboard from which to carry out other items on our agenda. We should use the poaching issue to further deepen the divide between our nation and China, utilizing it to impose sanctions on the hostile power flooding our communities with fentanyl. We can further utilize the pollution issue to promote a stateside manufacturing renaissance. If we truly care about pollution, wouldn't we cut economic ties with China immediately? Perhaps the strongest tangible argument against immigration is the Malthusian overcrowding of our country and the proliferation of trash blanketing our cities in the southwestern desert. Those who have thrown open our borders have done so thoughtlessly. Nay, they have done so in a calculated manner. Wide open and wild spaces are decried as wastes of space. The unspoiled wilderness is seen as a barren waste, some productive land that must be plundered and put to use. By crowing that our nation has plenty of room, the rulers of the darkness of this world betray their true motivation. They want to turn Yellowstone and Arcadia into a ghetto, a sprawling strip mall, dotted with gas stations, methadone clinics, and payday loan operators. There was also a veritable litany of cases of illegal aliens raping and abusing our farm and pet animals. Horrific practices like dogfighting are prevalent in these certain subsets of the population. The grotesqueries of factory farming, wholly antithetical to our agrarian roots, are directed from on high by corporate leftists and perpetuated by the illegal serfs in their employ. The recent video expose of one of the dairy farms supplying Fairlife milk is but the tip of an iceberg. So, I think there's something to this. It goes right back to the agrarian tradition and what Who Owns America is really about. And it's why that is it's a core component of what we do at the Institute. Think small, decentralization, think locally, act locally, the Jeffersonian Southern tradition, all these things are there to preserve and explore that Southern tradition. Until next time,